Right, this morning, of course, we turn our focus on matter security, and we are looking at what is happening in the country as far as the political tone and tenor is concerned, since now, of course, the elections are over. But it seems the political tone and tenor has taken a sour note, looking and going by the stories that we've just done this morning. So what does this portend for this country? And of course, people, even yesterday when we had a conversation, we're talking about our failed state. Just have a feel and flavor of what we discussed yesterday a bit.
Where we are, this regime has muzzled virtually every independent state and non-state actor. And the only element that is still holding on is the judiciary. If we succeed in muzzling the judiciary, then the constitution is completely buried and sealed.
You cannot choose which sections of the constitution to obey or respect and ignore others. That's not what you adjudge yourself to be, to be lawful or to be law-abiding.
Stop these games as the people we have entrusted with the leadership on both sides. You don't need to be in State House for you to be my leader.
It's a failed state. Let me tell Professor Amanyora, a failed state. The sooner we begin the talks, the better.
They say it's a failed state. The sooner as we begin the talk, the better. Allow me to introduce our panelists this morning who are with us this morning to talk us through, of course, that and a raft of other issues as well that we'll look internationally. We have with us Professor Noah Midamba, who's the Vice Chancellor of KCA University, also an expert on defense and foreign policy. Also, we do have with us Ambassador Stefano Dejak, who is the EU ambassador represented here in Kenya. Also, we do have with us Ambassador Erastus Mwancha, who is the former deputy chair of African Union. Also, we do have with us Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is a conflict resolution and national security expert. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Going by the stories that we've done, also hearing the clip, as I mentioned before, the political tone and tenor in this country is changing dramatically. It seems things are not really, okay as far as the tone and tenor is concerned. Is it hitting a somber note? Is it hitting a very sour note? Let's begin with you, Professor Noah Midamba.
Tubal, on this stage, we have called for the President of the Republic and the Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga to engage in a meaningful dialogue for the course of this country. And it seems to me that the hardcore on both sides have managed to make sure that these two gentlemen has not met. Whatever the consequences, this is downslide. This is not good for the country. The president has put forth 4 pillars of development. That development cannot take place unless there is a meaningful dialogue in the country. The government, it seems to me that on Raila's side, they've been very tactful, master tactful, in creating a long-term political strategy that captured the hearts and minds of young people, very large number of young people. The government is left to react. And in a democracy like this, the government must be seen as clear and deliberate and even-handed and always on the side of law. And it seems that there is a disconnect right now. And without a meaningful relationship between the law and the people in a democracy, the consequence is very serious for the country.
All right. Let's hear from His Excellency Stefano. Looking at this particular event, of course, also the European Union released their report on the elections, that is the observers. And we know that also was discussed in the European Parliament as well. But from your own observation, I know you've been holding talks with, both sides of a divide, with President Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga as a diplomatic mission in this country. What are you learning? Well,
I'm learning that Kenya is a very vibrant democracy that resembles democracy in Europe and in the United States. Typically, the time of election is a time when all those who run for the elections are dramatizing their differences. In Kenya, of course, there's been this exceptional development of the annulment of the presidential election, which has prolonged the state of confrontation between the two parties, and to the extent of the withdrawal of Raila Odinga from running the October 26 election. So, in my view, it's not totally surprising that such a long time in confronting each other results in a difficult digestion, so to speak, of this period. This, to a certain extent, happens everywhere, and I'm not surprised that it happens here. I hope that as soon as possible it will be reabsorbed in what the Constitution provides for, and it will take Parliament as its natural forum for discussion and confrontation of the different political sides. But it's still, in my view, an element that demonstrates to which extent Kenya is a flag bearer of democracy in the country. It is not perfect, but who is perfect? I doubt that any of the 28 member states of the European Union are perfect.
Right.
In this.
Yeah, just maybe to pick up also from the European Union Election Observers Mission, this particular final report, if you might just pick it and show it to the public as well, to just pick some elements there, because I think the bone of contention we're having right now, especially in this country, is the electoral reforms as well. And you say here on this is the second, I think the second item, if you may just pick it for our viewers as well, this is number 2, that electoral reforms needs to be carried out well in advance of any election and to be based on broad consensus. The very late legal amendments and appointment of a leadership of an independent electoral and boundaries commission before the 2017 elections put excessive pressure on the new election and administration. And of course, this has been the key element that is leading up to all these protests that we're seeing. And of course, it's very unfortunate that even we've had someone losing his life yesterday because of a protest as well. So electoral reforms in this country, I think that has been a key element. I know you were not there in Parliament to discuss this as well, but it was also a discussion that, of course, was on the floor of the House at the European Parliament, the EU Parliament.
Yes, there was a quite long debate at the European Union Parliament, and I think all speakers in this debate appreciated the vibrancy of Kenya's democracy.
Yes.
Although, of course, with different shades, depending on their views, their political parties. They also noticed that there's room for improvement, and this room for improvement is at its best if it is agreed upon some due time before the election and not a few months before, because you don't change the rule of the games when the two teams are already on the field ready to play the game. This is I continue to indicate as a reference the example of football, because it's clear to everyone if the two teams are already on the field, the referee doesn't go and changes the rule at the last minute. This must be done a little bit before.
Thank you. All right, let's hear from Ambassador Erastus Omwencha. Welcome back, and of course you can give us a report from the African Union summit that we just had, I think, last week. I know you attended. Just briefly, the highlights, then before also you can weigh in on this topic that we're having this morning as well.
Thank you very much, Adipa. And may I also say a word of honor to fellow panelists. Of course, I was in Addis Ababa last week, and the key highlights of that meeting, of course, was looking at the issues that affect Africa, And one of course, the summit's topic was on corruption, and how corruption, of course, has affected Africa, because Africa is a continent that is very well endowed with resources, with people that are hardworking, but paradoxically we continue to remain poor. And part of the reason is because of hemorrhage from this continent, but also poor stewardship of the resources that we have in our economies. And I think this is encouraging to see that our leaders can even start to talk about this kind of issues at that fora, and they start to think of how to put in place mechanisms to address good governance, because it's all part of governance. Now coming to the topic at hand, and I tend to agree with the Ambassador what he has said, and even Professor Mdimba. There is always a very thin line between peace and chaos. There is always a very thin line between, democracy put a test and where you could easily falter. And as he says, there is no perfect country that has really has, demonstrated perfect democracy as such. But what is normally accepted is when the country is at peace with itself, that the people can go about their business on a daily basis, and that people can focus on the key issues that affect the nation, lifting the people in terms of their quality of life, and developing the nation in all aspects, whether you're talking of education, health, and the rest. What I now can't understand is, if you look at the efforts and attention and our mindset at the moment, this preoccupation is not good for the country. And therefore, we must sit down and ask ourselves, these manifestations show that there's something that we must do about it. And the moment we accept that, just like example I've given on corruption at the continent level, the better. Because any problem to be solved, the very first stage is to recognize the problem, and then you can now look for solutions. And I think it's important to say something is not going well at the moment, let's look for a solution for it.
All right, let's hear from Dr. Mustafa. Good morning.
Edibal, clearly there are issues that will need to be straightened in this country. First of all, in terms of talking or ascribing the failed state tag to the current situation. To some extent, we can talk about fragility and not a failed state. A failed state is that political body that that has disintegrated to a point where the state itself is unable to control its territory, is unable to control or no longer has the monopoly of the physical force inside the territory itself, is unable to do a range of issues, including dealing with other countries in the international relations. And what causes that is something that we seem to be in some ways on that path. One is what Ambassador Mwencha has just talked about, corruption and misuse of public office, corralling of national resources. We see that in this country. There are people who serve in government. There are people who have taken to various offices, political offices, whose character is questionable. Some of them are basically thugs. We talked about this last time. Allow me to focus on the issue of the current political stalemate in this country, which is unnecessary. There is no point at all. Kenya has had an election, and many the African Union, the EU, IGAD, many institutions around the world that actually observed the election said it was okay. We can never have a perfect election, yes, but that was okay. It passes. So the need for some people to try and undermine that authority is what then might make Kenya to become more fragile, leading to for it to become a failed state. And perhaps this is why the government is reacting in the manner that it is reacting. Not that it's wholly right. There's some ways that the government has reacted that it's outside the constitution. Those people who went to Uhuru Park and did what they did, did so outside the constitution. And here is a path that we are putting ourselves in that is not good at all. And this is coming as a result of our juvenile politics, Dibal. Our political parties are personalized, our political parties do not have ideology, and that's why people are just running like headless chicken everywhere. And what we need to do is to appeal to the sober minds within the various political parties to sober up and to infuse some kind of ideology in those political parties. And let us resolve all issues that are affecting this country within the provisions of the Constitution. That way, then we are going to ensure that we don't move that, or we don't make this country more fragile than it is at the moment.
And from this, morass, no one is really coming out clean as well, not even the government, not the opposition, just as you've mentioned, because we can see, yes, maybe this was not really within the confines of the constitution that they were holding up this particular, swearing-in ceremony at Uhuru Park. And of course, also we can see also the government is not acting in the confines of the constitution by inordinately also disobeying court orders, even to present, someone like Miguna or his whereabouts when he should be actually in court as well. So no one is wrong. But we can say what you actually, or I'm picking from you as well, is the fact that it begins with an implosion inside the country before even we explode, where maybe the avenues and the check and balances of institutions are not really, adhered to, that we disregard in our institutions that they have been established by the Constitution to run or a smooth, seamlessly flowing, government. So in that light, if we do not really obey any institution, then it means there's that proclivity to disobey any other institution, for that matter. Let's hear from you, Professor Nombe.
There are 2 points that my friend Christopher Ali brought up, and I want to emphasize them, and I want Kenyans to understand the context on which we are talking about. Because we are not here to take any side. We are here to educate the public about the issues, and we are also here for the betterment of the country. That's what we want everyone to understand. Let me have a very clear definition of a failed state so that people can have a clear judgment. Paul Roberts, former Assistant Secretary for Treasury under Reagan administration, probably came up with a much better definition, which I like Kenya to hear. A failed state is perceived as having failed at some of the basic conditions and responsibility of a sovereign government. That's what. Now, how do you see a failed state? Loss of fiscal control of territory, erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, inability to provide reasonable public service, inability to interact with other states as a full member of the international community, and last, characterized by social, political, and economic failure. So when you take that description, Kenya is not a failed state, period. What we need to talk about is the character that bring about this kind of conflict. And it is simply dialogue. When dialogue fail, a meaningful dialogue fail, that's why we have 2 ambassadors here. They spend years learning and understand what it takes to interact in a meaningful way. I spent years myself searching and producing documents on how to interact in a meaningful way. People go to war because they're not able to communicate. And what is it that stops our leaders from having a meaningful dialogue for the betterment of the country? As we know, the opposite of non-dialogue is the state where we are. Muguna is being made a hero. The government is reacting. And the person looking, the ordinary person, like my students who are looking, is wondering, when I complete my school, what kind of environment am I going to be? Is there going to be a job opportunity? Am I going to live in an area where I'm about to be shot or killed by a rogue person? What kind of country are we creating? Investors are going to continue living with this. And so there is not going to be job opportunity, period. And the president will not have opportunity to implement his strategy with this kind of background. So what we are asking, like what Christopher said, let's
Mustafa.
talk, Christopher. Yes, that's his, yeah.
Mustafa.
Mustafa. Yeah. Mustafa, sorry.
Yeah, you've just been baptized, huh?
Yeah.
That's fine.
Christopher, let's step back.
Yes.
Let's step back and have a sober mind and think about the long term of this country and think about our democracy that we have created. Yes, Europe has had democracy for a long time. They have their own problem. But ours is fragile. It's very new. Most people don't understand it. When I went to Arosa 3 weeks ago, I left the airport going to the town, and there were groups of people surrounding, making noise and all that, and I thought it was like Kenya, they were having political rally. No, these people were having a rally to understand the government policy and implement. What's wrong with us doing that? They have more ethnic groups than we do in Kenya. And we have only 42 ethnic groups. What is wrong with us having a meaningful dialogue? We cannot afford to have this kind of situation.
All right, we have 2 minutes to take a short break, but I want to also come to you, Ambassador. And looking from the fraternity of the European Union, we can say from Europe itself, where we have cases of, what we could call a failed state. Case in point will be Ukraine right now. We know the warring factions that has been going on there with the Crimea and Russia and so on and so forth. How would you describe, from your own estimation, a failed state?
A failed state is a state that fails to perform the functions of the state. And the function of the state is serving the people. It's very simple in my view. When the state becomes unable to deliver to its people the peace, the prosperity, the right environment, then it becomes a war, as a famous philosopher said, of everyone against everyone. Homo homini lupus. Every man becomes a wolf to his fellow men. And these are the rules, the basics of the social pact. Mustafa Ali was mentioning the monopoly of force, which is fundamental. Nobody can attack anybody else without reprieve where a state exists. This is justice. No justice, no state. So when everyone can do whatever they want without rules, that is a failed state, exactly like a football match without a referee becomes chaos, and it's no more a game.
So it's watching the bare minimum that if the state fails to provide the basics, expectation and the basics, the tenets of functions of government, then that is a failed state, which I think also you mentioned the issue of governance, issue of education, security, extreme poverty. If it's there, they were unable to alleviate that, then we are actually headed to a failed state. Let's say from Erastus Omoncha, from my own estimation, Mustafa says we are far away from, what a failed state should be, of course, but the indications, and we have the hallmarks of them happening right now. If you're not really careful and if you don't really stem the tide right now, we could be headed there.
Yes, Dipal. I think what Professor Mdamba said, I agree with him totally, because although this definition has not been accepted internationally, as he said, it was actually from a US perspective, And it was only in the 90s that this definition started coming into the national scene.
So as it is, we don't have an ironclad
We don't have
definition
internationally
of
accepted definition
Okay.
of a failed state. But I think we must also distinguish between a failed state and failed democracy. Because, I mean, as you rightly mentioned, if you look at Kenya, it's far from being a failed state. But you can look at the issues of democracy, how they're being tested, whether we are going in the right path. And that's where I want to pick up from where Ambassador Stefano said that the functions of the state, the sovereignty, is first of all to protect its territory, to protect its people, and provide basic services, but also interact with the international community as an acceptable state that has recognized authority, that is legitimate. And any of those elements might be weak because there are so many parameters. In one you might score 10, in another you score 1. So at the end then you judge is a country operating at that level. And if you check on all those elements, yes, we can say they are not present in Kenya. But there are fault lines which we must now start to ask about. How do we tackle them? In the light of what we say, there is an issue that we must be addressed.
All right, thank you. But thank you very much. We now go back to panelists to discuss this and a raft of other issues as well. And before we took a short break, we promised, of course, we shall be continuing with our discussion on what is a free or a failed state. That is what we have been discussing. And we will look also at the international stories as well. Taking the cases in points where we can actually look as a case study of the countries that we can say, quote unquote, they are failed state. Maybe we can come to you, Dr. Mustafa, as we wind up on that as well. We go now to other issues as well. Could you maybe mention to us, our neighbors, Somalia right now is a failed state. Which other countries can we maybe draw lessons from as a failed state?
Thank you, Dibal. Yeah, some of those indicators have been clearly discussed and elaborated by fellow panelists here. In terms of what are the countries that are failed in our neighbors that are failed? First of all, Somalia used to be a failed state. It no longer is a failed state. Somalia has come out of that tag of a failed state. It could relapse very quickly back into a failed state. For example, if AMISOM has a drawdown of its, military presence in Somalia because the EU and other supporters no longer wants to support it or no longer have the resources to support it.
But this turnaround has been so quick for Somalia, I should say then, if it's not really a failed state right now. How have they been able to shake off that particular tag? Are they able to provide the basic education that we're talking about, security for its people still? It's a problem, right? We are talking about governance because we just know a pocket of Somalia is peaceful, but looking at the entire region or the whole country in itself, even the territorial borders, as we were talking, the integrity of the territorial borders, still it's not there. Look at the extreme poverty that we are talking. It's still dependent on aid. So it's still proffering that pail in hand, looking for aid from other countries. You wouldn't say that it is not a failed state.
Yeah, if you look at the states that are very close to failed, like Burundi, for example, South Sudan, even Ethiopia, they still have some kind of an authority that kind of rules or is providing certain services, but not to the entire country. There was a time that Somalia did not even have a president, I think, did not even have a prime minister. It was basically entire territories were either held by Al-Shabaab or clan warlords and the others. But now there is a parliament. There are some state institutions which the Somalis and the Africa Union, the EU, and other bodies have actually worked very hard to ensure that some of those state institutions are founded or are strengthened, and they seem to be working to some extent. They are very weak, Dibal. Those state institutions are very weak, and it is because they are weak is that Somalia's fragility is so high. Remember, it's some kind of an ordinal. It's an index that you can put on an ordinal scale. You cannot say either or. No, it is the extent. And Somalia is extremely, extremely fragile, that it borders a failed state, actually. But it is moving away from a failed state, thanks to the African Union, thanks to the European Union, thanks to many countries in the region that are struggling to support that a fledgling state, if I may use that word. And so we cannot say that it really is failed because there are areas that Al-Shabaab is still controlling.
Right.
There are challenges between the federal government and the semi-autonomous regional government in terms of who controls what and how they are working together to address the problem, the problem of Al-Shabaab. So it is extremely fragile. I wouldn't call it a failed state at this point. It's come out of that.
All right. But you thank African Union, and of course they've been pulling out the troops from Somalia right now. President Uhuru Kenyatta has been there saying we cannot start pulling the troops out of Somalia right now because we we might be retrogressing on the progress that we've made so far in terms of stabilizing the country, right? If we pull out the troops, as he's indicated, and the African Union has been on it, we know so many countries right now, they're still pulling out from that we're talking about AMISOM, from the Somalian territory right now. How will that portend for the security of that country? You think, first of all, this is premature, or we should be pulling the troops out of Somalia? You now, as a former chair of AU.
There has to be a very organized, or call it managed, exit of foreign troops in Somalia. Of course, the foreign troops cannot continue to be there. In fact, as Mustafa has been saying, if you measure on a scale of 1 to 10 and put all those parameters of what constitutes an effective state, one of the things that you have to look at, who's in control in terms of the state authority. If you have a presence of too many foreign troops, that is not an indication of a state that is effective in terms of managing its territory. But the case of Somalia and some of the parameters he has rightly said are all right. Now, I should use this opportunity to thank our friends, the European Union, without whom actually Somalia would not be there. As having been directly involved in securing finances and supporting the AMISOM troops on the ground, I know how far we have come down the road. Actually, the only thing then I would really point out particularly to Stefano here is that the danger is once you start having this comfort that, oh, Somalia is now out of danger, and focus your attention elsewhere. The attention now is in Yemen. The attention now is in Syria. Then, of course, you have not made an effective state. Our call is that we must finish the job. Of course, the problem in the case of the war we are facing in Somalia is asymmetrical. Asymmetrical war is not a way you can reach a point and say the other army has surrendered, you can now plant your flag, and the war is finished. Asymmetrical war, the people, the Al-Shabaab melt, they melt into society and they lie dormant, but they have a capability of organizing at very short notice and hit back. So to have this, it means you must mobilize civilians, have complete governance of the state, and have the total population involved. So we are still a long way, and I don't want us to really think that we have arrived, we are out of the woods. But that requires the total commitment of the national community, and that's where pulling out of these forces must be managed, because if you pull out, Al-Shabaab is still dormant. It can still resurface and cause chaos. So let's really go accompany them until we can all be sure that the regional government, the state, the elections, when you can feel you can walk safely all over, there are no landmines, demine the country and ensure. But that also means you must start providing jobs because with unemployment, it's very easy to have this entitled population that you can mobilize and cause chaos.
All right, but isn't that also what they've been fearing, Ambassador? First of all, we've had them saying that we need to pull out our troops, especially Kenya, the boots on the ground in Somalia, and then we will not really have these flare-ups and the grenades being thrown every which way in this country, and the bomb blasts as well. But from your own estimation, you think, first of all, that we've stayed way too long without any exit strategy in Somalia, And now this is turning out at some, I think some of the parliamentarians in Somalia were saying now this is turning out to be a military occupation in Somalia.
Well, that depends very much on how the Somali themselves perceive the presence of foreign troops. If the foreign troops are perceived as peacekeepers, as guarantors of a certain level playing field for everyone not to be oppressed, then it is a positive role. If they are perceived as occupation troop doing bad things, then that is of course negative. I think on this I would agree with what President Kenyatta said at the African Union Summit. That is that yes, AMISOM is not there forever and shouldn't be there forever, because Somalis must be fully in control of their own territory and of their own destiny. On the other hand, one should not absolutely underestimate Al-Shabaab deep embedment into the Somali territory. Good parts of South Central Somalia are controlled directly or indirectly, because let's not forget, you don't need necessarily the flag and the direct control of a territory. You could also control by fear. That is a method that Al-Shabaab is using, by letting everyone know that if they don't behave in a certain way, eventually they get hit, they get killed, anytime, anywhere. This is a form of indirect control. But what is worse is that this has been going on since 2008. So Somalia is a very young country. We should be very worried, in my view, that Al-Shabaab has been growing up a new generation of Somalis that have been totally brainwashed to be extremists, and dangerous extremists at that. This is a threat for Somalia itself, but it is also very much for all the countries around. If it becomes a hotbed of violence, violent extremism, this is a concern that Kenya, of course, cannot underestimate, and that is why I think the transition should be a rather considerate one, not a hurried one, and adapt to realities on the ground. Sometimes it's a risk to let the Somalis take control of their own territory, but it's a risk worth running. Sometimes you shouldn't run that risk, because you could end up with a complete opposite. And this is what you see also in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, you know, in Afghanistan. So there are so many examples in the world. Somalia is not the only case.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned it shouldn't be hurried. Are they actually treating it in a very ham-fisted attempt? Is it a ham-fisted attempt that we are seeing? Maybe this was not really in the game plan. It came from the left side. They have a summit. They need to announce this. But was there a strategy in the beginning?
Dobal, while I agree with my colleagues here on the podium in most of what they have said, here's my point. Somalia has never been together as a country. The only time that we can say, yes, Somalia was relatively peaceful, relatively under control, was when Siad Barre was there. And all other time, there have been chaos and continuous fight that's going on. So that's number one that people need to remember. Secondly, Africans themselves are not contributing their minimum contribution to sustain AU and sustain management of African conflict. And Europeans are giving so much, over 70%, and Americans and everybody. And we cannot be depending on others to manage what is happening in Africa and say we can sustain ourselves. Burundian troops who are fighting there are not going there because of African commitment.
Yes.
They're going there because they're earning their interest. That is not good enough. Lastly, building a state and maintaining a state with the outside occupation has never been successful in the history of man, whether it's colonial government or whether it's other occupation. The most important thing is Somalia must take responsibility for themselves with assistance from OAU and all other people. And my last point, it will be a shame if we don't secure the Kenya border by the time this all end up one way or another. We must secure our border.
We must secure our border. Yes. You
Just
can
a
run
small-
it. Yes.
Just to respond to what Prof has said, Africa recognizes the fact that its own sovereignty and legitimacy must also, and authority must be accompanied by our political rhetoric. We must also dig into our pocket, and that is part of the conversation that has been going on at the African Union, where Africa is now trying to raise resources. And when I started talking about corruption and the rest, we have always been saying Africa is not poor, Africa has got the resources, we can manage our resources. But all that said, we must say that according to the UN Charter, peace and security is a responsibility of the international community. And in fact, that's one. The second one, it is Africa is not that we are not contributing there.
Yes.
We are contributing by our sons and daughters dying their blood. And how much does that constitute? If you look at the number of forces that have died, the UN system was not ready to send troops. They only sent, if you listen to what Stefano said, they talked of peacekeeping. In Somalia, it's not peacekeeping. And they only want to come and do peacekeeping, but not under Chapter 6, to be in the offensive, to go and fight forces like Al-Shabaab, where you lose forces. So you can't say that's not contribution. Africa is contributing through these, how many people we lost there from Kenya? That is a contribution. So yes, if you are counting cents and dollars, you might say, but I wouldn't say that that's not a contribution from Africa. Africa has contributed. And in any case, if we go through that territory, there is much that we can discuss that is still not to be said, and I beg that we don't go that route.
Right, and of course, yes,
Yeah,
Dr. Mustafa.
this is very important, what Ambassador Mwencha is talking about, and what Professor Midamba has said, that yes, we Africans have to contribute to making sure that Somalia regains its essence in a way. The Somalis themselves have to make a decision whether they want to have a country or not. And it's up to the Somalis to do so.
Yes.
AU and others are not going to be there forever. The point that Ambassador Mwencha is saying is so important, is that the contribution need not just be looked at in terms of financial contribution. Number one is that there are many soldiers that are paying with their lives who are Africans. The second point here is that some of those countries that used to contribute the highest to the Africa Union were torn apart by Western powers. And I'm glad that Ambassador Stefano is here, and I hope he'll take this message to Brussels. Libya used to contribute a lot of resources to Africa Union. UN Security Council Resolution 1973 to protect Benghazi was extended to become a regime change, United Nations Security Council resolution. And what is happening today in Libya has got to be blamed, yes, partly by Libyans, but largely by the United States of America and some countries in the West. And they have to fix that country. The slavery that is going on in Libya today is partly because of the Western countries invading that country, helping in taking out a regime without caring how that country is going to be ruled, or rather is going to to move forward. The second point here is, Dibal, that some of these resources that the EU, and we thank the European Union, we thank the United States of America for contributing resources to stabilize some parts of the country. Some of these resources, you know, when the West colonized Africa, they took away a lot of resources from us. And it's a moral responsibility for the Western countries and the United States of America to help Africa to stabilize certain parts. DR Congo was plundered by King Leopold II. He killed 8 million, more than 8 million in the last genocide of the 19th century. You know, who is even talking about that? Part of Belgium was built by the resources plundered from the DR Congo. And so the EU has got to look at some of the historical issues that the Western countries contributed to putting some of the African countries to where they are today. I'm not saying that Somalia is part of that. No. Somalis broke their own countries with their own hands, and they have to fix it, and we need to help them to do that. But we need to look at this in a more holistic manner, that we have to help each other.
Thank you. And of course, I want to also drill this conversation deeper. As we mentioned, we shall look at what is happening also internationally. Let's begin with South Africa. They say that today is going to be a big day for the ANC, making a big announcement of concern, and this is the likelihood of making sure maybe President Zuma is shown the door. Will he be forced to resign before you leave, Dr. Mustafa? Well, looking at your crystal ball today, and of course the performance of President Zuma so far, we know he's been embroiled in corruption, issues, of course, with the hyperbolic figure of maintaining or trying to, of course, renovate his house. We know the issue of the Gupta family. The economy of South Africa at some point was actually in a junk, state, and then they were redeemed as well. Yeah. How has it performed so far?
I hope Zuma resigns, actually. South Africa, unlike Kenya, is
given a choice, he won't. But will he be forced?
I hope the party actually forces him to resign. And for the very reason, the difference between Kenya and South Africa is that the party has a very vibrant democracy. And so there's no one single person owning a party. There is some kind of an ideology still, party ideology in South Africa. And so it's not personalized, and that the party, they're just like the Chama cha Mapinduzi next door in Tanzania, is still very strong, and it actually is the one that chooses the presidential flag bearer. That's why anybody can become a president in these countries. It doesn't matter your background. If we take an example of a country like Italy, Berlusconi resigned so many times, he was actually forced out, isn't it? Because of the vibrancy of democracy in that country. It doesn't mean that when a president serves or a prime minister serves for 5 months, 6 months, or 1 year or 2 years, like Berlusconi did, and then he is taken off, that country is weak. No, that's part of democracy. That's part of building and cleaning state institutions and ensuring that there is some sanity in the country. And I hope that happens in South Africa. South Africa has been a beacon of hope, actually. But what we see with corruption and state institutions being hollowed out by Zuma and his cohorts, I think he needs to see that. But we also need to respect Zuma. He's played a big role in South Africa. He played a big role in the emancipation of South Africa, and it's up to him to protect that legacy by leaving now and handing over power.
All right, and talking of vibrancy of the party, having a party ideology, inter-party democracy as well, ANC also was really going down the tubes. Do you think that also the election of Cyril Ramaphosa, to become the chair of ANC, also some sort of, could you say, sobriety has been brought to the party?
I think
confidence
so,
as well?
To some extent. Of course, Ramaphosa is a businessman, and if you look at some of the economic challenges in mining, the people that were killed were gunned down in one of the mines. There was some connection to Cyril Ramaphosa. But if he has won the confidence of the majority of the ANC members
Yes.
and leaders, then let him move on. But again, South Africa is a project in progress. We need to see that succeed, and we need to see South Africa is going to succeed if the economic interests in South Africa distributed across the board, and the highly unequal society that we see in South Africa, the gap between the poor and the rich, the whites and the black is narrowed. That way then South Africa will move and become a much stronger state.
All right. So I'll release you also, Dr. Mustafa. I know you have a meeting now, so I think this will be a wonderful opportunity to maybe also release you as well. Thank you very much for your contribution this morning.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right, let's hear from Erastus Omancha to tell us more about South Africa and today's meeting as well. What will be also your input?
I think there are two issues here. There is one is reality and the other one is history. The reality is that you have now a situation in South Africa where there are two centers of power. You have President Zuma, who is heading the executive.
Yes.
And you have Cyril Ramaphosa, who is heading the party. And if you look at the South African governance structure,
yes,
the party is really the one that is above the executive, because the executive is born out of the party. And so the history part of it, that's the reality now. The history part of it is what happened to President Mbeki seems to be at play at this time. And the second one is the performance of ANC in the last elections. Ordinarily, the election is supposed to be around April or so next year. There is no way Cyril Ramaphosa will sit and wait, heading a party that performed so poorly in the last election. You can see Freedom Party and other parties, the National Democratic Party, making a lot of progress in terms of diminishing the mandate of ANC to go to the election, and with all the accusations that have been leveled against the party. So he would want to cleanse the party. This is the platform, and this is what he said, both in his election speech, but also in Davos recently. So he must be in a hurry to make sure that he's in charge by the time election comes. And of course, he's equipped with history.
Yes.
Because he knows this happened with President Mbeki before, except the last time it happened, the order was different. President Mbeki was recalled by the party. And when he was recalled, there was a void, and then elections for the party took place, and the President Zuma took over.
Right.
So he went to the elections as leader of the party, although there's Montlane who was put in charge temporarily, but it was clear that he was not the one running the party. He was only running the executive during that time.
Right. Just maybe refresh my memory. Why was Thabo Mbeki recalled by the party? Was it because of his performance, or what was the reason?
Precisely. In fact, I mean, the accusation against him, this is the point that Mustafa was making. South Africa, to me, is a crisis that was waiting to happen. A crisis for one reason. Expectations were too high, and that whatever you did, meeting those expectations was not going to be easy. Here's a country that has been under apartheid for a long time. And for them, the end of apartheid meant a lot of things. That this gap would diminish. The Africans would get jobs. They would own the economy. And that none of those has happened to the extent the expectations were. So the people are disappointed. And this is part of now the introspection that is happening, that the reality must set in, that these expectations are going to be elusive.
Right.
So President Mbeki was seen as not addressing these core issues, and he was spending too much time on international issues. So the party recalled him.
Okay. Thank you. Let's hear from Ambassador Stefan.
Well, there's so many ways that you can judge the ongoing situation, but I think a fundamental way that we sometimes forget is to compare with the situation in countries, neighboring countries, and that is also a parameter that you can use. I mean, the more South Africa might have the problems that you like to stress, but there's no doubt that a fundamental comparison is the one between Zimbabwe and South Africa, that are very close. And in Zimbabwe, to change the president, you need what looked very much like a coup d'etat, with the military taking over and deciding what to do. While in South Africa, the crisis is absorbed by the rules of the democratic game. Those rules can be stretched or not, but still they function. This is a fundamental difference that needs to be taken into account. South Africa is still a country where citizens feel that they have a voice and a role in approving or disproving what their rulers do. In Zimbabwe, up until, as we've seen, the joy of the people when Mugabe had to step down, it's been very, very different indeed.
And of course, you mentioned earlier while we were discussing that issues of corruption as well is very systemic. And of course, that also could be a predisposing factor where we can see it can be leading up also to a failed state as well. So if we peel back the layers, we can find one niggling worry will be corruption in a country as well. And we can talk about this in Somalia, we can talk about this in Zimbabwe, we can talk about this also in South Africa right now, because that is the bane of what is happening in South Africa, issue of corruption and mismanagement by President Jacob Zuma. Let's hear from Norman Damba.
Dubal, yes, my colleagues here are on the right tracks. Ambassador Munja enumerated some historical issues and also expectation, you know, looking at the history and looking where we are right now. And when you take Africa as a whole in the context of from the nationalist movement into the modern government, it does not work well at all. Whether you look at KANU here, or you look at Zimbabwe's situation, or the ones that are really work closer to what we may say a nice transition is Tanzania because of Nyerere and the work. But if you look at Nigeria, look at Ghana, it has not worked. And so the situation here is Nelson Mandela understood this right away from the time that he took over, that he cannot sustain, he cannot stay longer, because the expectation of the people, majority of the people in South Africa, was overwhelming. Jobs, opportunities, and everything. If you look at demographic situation right now, the rift has got bigger. The rich has got richer, the poor has got poor, and for Jacob Zuma coming in with completely maybe a different mindset than Nelson Mandela have, to manage that is impossible. And therefore, the wisest thing that Jacob Zuma can do for this continent and for the people of South Africa is to resign. Impeaching him, removing him, is not good for the country. And that I hope that he heed that and that he make announcement and walk away. Now, the question, will Ramaphosa really fit into the kind of expectation? Will he be able to manage that situation? Time is yet to tell. It would have been really a situation where we get closer to the Scandinavian model, where we bridge the gap between the have and the have-not. And I don't see it happening anytime in South Africa.
All right.
Very good point that Professor's made. I see ANC, this is now almost approaching 30 years, is getting into what you call middle-age crisis, when it has now to have a crisis of identity and manage also the expectations. you know, fighting for end of apartheid, there was no discord. There could have been discord among those who said, should we go through armed struggles? Should we use Indira Gandhi methods? But that was a very minor difference. There was a common goal that united them. Now that's behind. You are now managing the state. Part of this crisis of managing expectations is there are those within the party now who feel the party has moved too much right. You know, left the bourgeois still in place, and the corruption is flourishing, the rich are getting richer, while the poor are getting poorer. There are those leftists who say, nationalize land, you know, let's get equity and all that. And that's the crisis the party is having also. So that is identity problem. Which path is the party going to take? And of course you can see the peeling off, for instance, the Malema group. These are the youth who have no patience, who felt that the leadership is not delivering. And so the party, of course ANC still remains very popular.
Yes.
ANC, I could guarantee that the next election ANC would win, you know, with all probability.
Yes.
But the ANC must renew itself and align to, because the youth who are growing up do not even remember the story of apartheid. They are young. For them now it's jobs, it's education, it's standard of living.
Yes.
And so those are the things that the party must address.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's drill deeper also, and we look at the Iran nuke deal as well. And we've heard and we've seen now, we've just read a story that Iran will not renegotiate nuclear deal. That is according to President Rouhani. And of course, he said that the nuclear deal, which it signed with the world powers in 2015 under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran agrees to hold its nuclear weapon program in exchange for economic aid and lifting of international sanctions. However, we know the development that US President Donald Trump has called for decertifying the agreement, alleging that Iran had committed multiple violations, which Tehran has denied. What are we faced with right now, Ambassador Stefano, as far as this particular Iran nuke deal is concerned? I know President Benjamin Netanyahu was really against this particular deal with Iran, which was, of course, being orchestrated by President Barack Obama. And he came and said, I'm like the Messiah, you know, if you may remember Moses delivering the Israelites from Egypt. And he knew this, he said, and labeled it as a bad deal. So we can see also Donald Trump is trying to ruffle feathers as far as this particular deal is concerned. What are we facing?
Well, first of all, let me fly my flag a little moment, because the orchestrator of that deal was actually Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Union for foreign policy, who was a kind of coordinator of a number of key international actors in negotiating with Iran this deal in 2015. I think it is a very delicate situation, and the deal is a way forward.
Yes.
So there will be jostling from various sides. What we're looking at the moment, maybe it's a part of that game, but fundamentally we need that deal to stay on, because it was negotiated in full agreement by the biggest international actors, and the EU provided a kind of a cover to make sure that there would be a balance in and a reliability. That is also why Federica Mogherini insists that the European Union is currently the most reliable partner, meaning that we don't have these dramatic shifts between parties in our international projection. And we are providing a stability, a continuity, so that this delicate deal will be kept away from, let's say, internal politics of the single actors, because the situation in the wider Middle East is so delicate and potentially explosive that we need, with all the effects that deals may have, we need deals, we need a negotiated way towards peace rather than multiple wars as we see in the Middle East.
Did you agree also with President Trump's attempts to decertify this particular deal?
No, personally, I cannot agree because I think this deal needs to be sustained. No deal, we go back with a situation where every actor feels they can do whatever.
Yes.
So criticism is always welcome in a way. It's a way also to advance the deal. So we have to see also how President Trump will eventually play his hand, if his hand is at affecting the stability of the deal, or it's a way to make it go forward. This is always a question mark because you never know if the criticism is a constructive or is a destructive criticism. In case it is a destructive, I couldn't agree. If it is a constructive, maybe it's useful.
Right. And I think also it is important to couple it up also with what is happening with the nuclear deal, that is the North Korea nuclear deal as well, even as we're winding up, Ambassador. From your own estimation from this particular development, we've seen also Donald Trump has been a total balls up in terms of, you know, trying to negotiate this particular, or not really to negotiate with President Kim Jong, of course, of North Korea so far. He's called him, you know, yeah, we'll actually exact fire and fury. He's called him the nuclear boy and all that jazz. And we've seen this also has, yeah, the Rocket Man, yeah.
It was a song by Elton John.
Yeah. So in terms of handling this particular very critical and a very sensitive issue with the nuclear deal or the nuclear missile in North Korea, do you think also we are teetering on the border where things might go, you know, awry in terms of the nuclear deal or the nuclear in North Korea?
Well, these are very fundamental issues. There is a famous definition of during the Cold War between the Soviet Union, the United States of America and its allies. Nikita Khrushchev at one point when the US and the USSR moved into the direction of a deal, famously said, after a nuclear war, the ashes of a communist will not be distinguishable from the ashes of a capitalist.
Interesting.
So, and this is nowadays very true for so many challenges. Let's look at climate is just as dangerous as nuclear war. And this allows me to go back to one thing that Mustafa was mentioning before when he referred to the moral responsibilities of the former colonial powers. I think that the world has moved on. We have a shared responsibility for the planet. So every challenge, be it nuclear, be it climate, be it terrorism, nowadays, and this is what Ambassador Wencha was mentioning before, must be shared. We have a partnership because this planet is getting smaller and smaller by the day, and it's also by the day endangered by these global challenges. Nuclear war is just one, because climate is just as dangerous as a nuclear war. And we have to share them together and share the burden to try to solve it. No matter how high gets the, let's say, the politicking and the tension at certain moments.
Thank you. Right. Professor Naomi Damba, as we're winding up as well.
The BAL, I agree with Ambassador Stefano, and particularly when he cite Nikita Khrushchev, famous say. President Trump has lost all international objectivity, reliability. His image is tarnished both at home and international. He is no longer a moral leader of the free world. And the point is to renegotiate with President Rouhani, who has the upper hand right now. President Rouhani has the upper hand because he's maintaining the deal. The deal was negotiated by world power. The deal is not perfect. There is no such thing like international deal that is perfect. But it's a way forward, like Ambassador Stefano said. And in order to go back and renegotiate, it will not happen. I tell you the reason. Iran is looking at North Korea the way that Trump is threatening North Korea. Iran is looking at Libya, the way Libya has been trashed. And Iran is saying, what? We are not going to renegotiate. And the opposite to that, if Trump pull out, and thanks God, I hope European nations will not pull out, because Iran will now be on its way to a thermonuclear weapon.
Right. Let's hear from Ambassador Russell Zomancho.
Very much in agreement, especially with the wisdom that has been shared concerning the issue of shared international responsibility. What it appears the American administration is doing is to unmake anything that was done by Democrats, and particularly if they has got the label of Obama, which is a very narrow view. Because if you walk out of the shared part of it is that if you keep the Europeans under this brilliant negotiated deal, because it has all, what is it that you want to achieve? Is you want to achieve that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear capability that can destroy, but Iran can use it for peaceful means, and that you have capacity to inspect and deterrent measures to ensure that is done. Those are there. Now, but for him, of course, he wants to humiliate Iran, and of course he has, if you look at the recent State of the Union statement, it had very little content on foreign policy. And the way it was toxic. He has drawn these 3 red lines of Iran, of Afghanistan, and of Korea, all of which are going to be very difficult for him to achieve. Because in Korea, he is not going to be able to do much with China sitting next door.
Yes.
So he can only, at the end of the day, walk back and come to the table because he is walking out of the party. And what will happen, then he will give room these states to be able to develop that nuclear capability without international obligations. So US must tread carefully, otherwise we'll go back into international lawlessness.
Thank you.
But
right.
one just comment.
Briefly as
we
well.
have to separate the shouting from the working.
Yes.
Because we are in an age of politics where shouting has become very popular. But the United States of America are a great democracy, and it's not only the declarations and the statement and the shouting of the heads of state that count. It is a huge system that I think will show also its necessity to work with others, even if the leader at times shouts a little bit over the top.